Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming here to share this time with us. And Joelle, thank you so much for inviting me to share this table with two of my heroes who give me such hope for the next generation of our community. So I'd like to bring the conversation back to, well, nuts and bolts, that's a bad metaphor, of diagnostic nomenclature. And exactly how are these stereotypes currently codified in psychiatric nosology or psychiatric classification, and what is the status of revision of that classification moving forward. So in particular, the two diagnostic categories that you've heard about are GID, so-called gender identity disorder, very much implying disordered gender identity, and so-called transvestic fetishism. So I'd like to talk about what is GID currently, how has it impacted and divided our community, and how would we measure progress, or the opposite of progress, in moving forward. And I would like to preface this just with my own view that there are two equally crucial issues on the table. And one is the issue of stigma that you've heard about so eloquently today, that is imposed upon all people who differ from the stereotypes and expectations of our assigned birth sex. And the second issue for that subset of our trans community who experience gender dysphoria. And if we could set aside maybe the historical social context and controversy that surrounds that term, but Dr. Randall Ehrber and I have clarified the clinical definition to be very, very simply distress. Painful distress with one's physical sex characteristics or ascribed gender role. And access for people who are specifically distressed with our anatomies. The solution is well proven, as many of us personally know in this room, that access to hormonal and surgical interventions can be quite successful in relieving that distress. But there are tremendous barriers, of course, that we continue to experience, to access that medical care. And these stereotypes of mental disability play a substantial role in those barriers. So I'd like to, again, preface my talk with two concurrent issues of stigma and medical necessity and access to medical transition care for those of us who need it, with my personal view that that we must as a community address both simultaneously, not one at the expense of the other, and not part of our community at the expense of another part of our community. So psychiatric diagnostic nomenclature in North America is codified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And I wish I'd brought mine, but Frontier would have charged me another $15 just for the weight of the book. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, currently edition 4 text revision. It is just a humongous, I forget how many, I actually love to show people a graphic of the number of diagnoses from the medical manual that was the DSM-1 up to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds today. And folks, that number ain't going to get any smaller as we move from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. The current diagnostic categories, GID and transvestic fetishism, were defined with their current diagnostic criteria in the DSM-4 in 1990, excuse me. And then there was a minor revision called text revision, that's where the DSM-4 TR comes from, that was published in 2004. But the intent of that was to only update the supporting text, but not the diagnostic criteria. It turns out that they cheated and actually did change diagnostic criteria in the TR while denying publicly that they did it. And they did it to clarify, for the purpose of preventing some overdiagnosis of some of the sexual disorders, including pedophilia. But they did not bother to take that opportunity to clarify some of our diagnoses at the same time. So the supporting text changed for us in 2004 with the current TR revision. The diagnostic criteria are the same going back to the original DSM-4. The former Clark Institute in Toronto, now known as CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, dominated the authorship of the current nomenclature that we have today. So what I've done, and this is, so everybody in the room should have a handout, and if you don't, I think Ken has some extra copies. And this is actually, most of this material is in a chapter in part 4 of my book, but this is sort of a summary of a much longer conversation that our reservation for the hotel would not allow. That really distills my top 10 list. You know, if I had Paul Schaefer in a band and a drummer with rim shots and sound effects, we could do this with a whole lot more drama. And sometimes it's healthy to laugh about this stuff because it is so tragic and impacts so many lives. So I'm just going to put this out there, and well, my purpose in doing so, one, is to summarize, into a fairly short list. This is not exhaustive. There are many, many, many concerns with the diagnosis, and this is particular to the category of gender identity disorder. But this is sort of my top 10, my most urgent, and I encourage everyone to think about maybe how your personal list might look. And as we move forward, I would kind of propose this kind of a list as a way to measure progress when we talk about proposals that are on the table or ideas and thoughts that people have for how we might move forward toward clinical nomenclature that does less harm and possibly more good. So, in no particular order, the first is a focus of pathology on nonconformity to assign birth sex, disregarding the definition of mental disorder that is adopted by the American Psychiatric Association. And I failed to mention that this humongous book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is published by the American Psychiatric Association, not the other APA. However, these gender diagnoses are dominated by Ph.D. psychologists and not by MD psychiatrists. However, there have been plenty of pathologizing MD psychiatrists in the history that have taken their shots as well. But focus of pathology. As homosexuality was, and didn't happen all at once, it actually happened excruciatingly slowly over a 14-year-old span, removed from this manual, and we, in particular, I'm falling apart here. And transsexual people were added. The diagnosis of transsexualism was introduced in the DSM-3 in 1980. The focus of pathology, there was a very clear agenda to shift the focus of pathology from object of affection to femininity itself, because they were really talking about trans women initially. And you've heard Julia and Joelle talk about the demonization of femininity, and this was all very, very much a part of it. And that history has really stuck with us in targeting gender identity and expression that differ from stereotypes and expectations of assigned birth sex. The current diagnostic criteria for GID are preoccupied with social gender role nonconformity, and especially for other children. The second, stigma. We talked about the major rubric of stigma of mental disorder and sexual deviance that is imposed upon emotions or expressions, and in my writing you've heard me use this phrase a lot, and I'm just going to keep on using it a lot. Emotions and expressions that are ordinary or even exemplary for everyone else are defined as symptomatic of mental craziness for us. The third and this touches upon, I guess, my second big issue, and then that of medical necessity and access to medical transition care. The current diagnostic criteria lack clarity on gender dysphoria, which again, I define as, along with Randall Ehrber, as clinically significant distress with physical sex characteristics or ascribed gender role. And ascribed gender role can mean assigned birth sex, or it can mean, in the present tense, how the world perceives you. And of course, if how the world perceives you is incongruent with how we perceive ourselves, then of course we are forced to live on a very alien world, indeed. And this seems ironic to some of us who haven't tortured ourselves by going through these diagnostic criteria, but because supportive care providers who are kind enough to sort of, help us around some of these obstacles, a lot of supportive care providers sort of use as synonymous GID and gender dysphoria, and use gender dysphoria as a more affirming term than GID. And you might think that GID was intended to be a gender dysphoria diagnosis, but it certainly is not. And in fact, gender dysphoria has become more and more obscure in recent revisions of the DSM, going back to 1980, to the point that it's actually hard to find. I mean, you just got to really, really look hard to find evidence of any notion of gender dysphoria in criteria, specifically in criterion B, which was originally supposed to be the gender dysphoria criterion. Today the wording is so mushy you can't find it. The only clear reference to gender dysphoria that you can find is an old definition in the glossary of the DSM that I think they forgot it was there. And it's terribly out of date. And then they nullify the whole thing with the words or, and some of us in this room are logicians, and the word or is a big deal to us, or a belief that he or she was born in the wrong sex. Well, guess what? So this is supposed to be about distress, but I haven't been distressed for a lot of years. But I will, to my dying day, as will many of us, believe that I was born physically in the wrong sex. So, by virtue of that belief, this is one of many, many examples of these little got-yous that pathologize people that meet no definition of mental illness. On the basis of that belief, I will, for the rest of my life, meet criterion B, regardless of whether there's any distress or impairment in my life at all. So, complete lack of clarity, complete obscurity of gender dysphoria, of distress. Which leads to my fourth, it contradicts transition and access to hormonal and surgical treatments. So our community is divided with a very real concern about access, which is tenuous. I mean, our access to hormonal and surgical treatments is difficult enough as it is. And I believe that it's certainly true that we need some diagnostic nomenclature which facilitates access to that treatment. This ain't it. This is literally intended to be a reparative therapy, or a gender reparative therapy diagnosis. And when I talk about contradiction of transition itself and of access to hormonal and surgical treatments, again, well proven to relieve the distress of gender dysphoria, according to the current diagnostic criteria, I am more mentally ill today, even though I'm comfortable in my body and very happy with my life, than I was when I was at very, very high risk, suffering in the closet. My fifth, the current diagnosis of GID encourages gender conversion or gender reparative therapies intended to change or shame one's gender identity or expression. If a child is shamed into the closet with a gender reparative therapy, that child no longer meets the diagnostic criteria. If a child transitions, or if an adult transitions, we immutably meet the diagnostic criteria and are forever classifiable as mentally ill. Number 6, a very misleading title of gender identity disorder, suggesting that our identities themselves are the focus of pathology. Our identity are disordered or deficient. Number 7, so maligning terminology, and I kind of coined the use of the term maligning to have a special meaning because of all the ugly, horrible names that we are called from the playground on up. Language which denies our legitimacy in our affirmed roles. Language which reduces us with pronouns and terms and names to our assigned birth sex in contradiction to our affirmed identities. That is so hurtful, so damaging, so dehumanizing to us. I mean, for me, it really is the N-word for us, for our community. That I feel that we need a special way of talking about that language to draw attention to it. And so I use the term maligning language or maligning terminology specifically to talk about labels, pronouns, terms, which disrespect, in particular, transitioned individuals with inappropriate pronouns and labels. And maligning language fills the diagnostic criteria and supporting text of the GID diagnosis. Our affirmed roles are called the other sex. Transsexual women are called males and he, and transsexual men are called females. Such demeaning terms deny our social legitimacy, and they empower defamatory social stereotypes like a man in a dress in the press, in the courts, in our workplace, and in our families. And you've heard a lot about this awful maligning language of autogynephilia. That was actually introduced most recently. It was introduced in the supporting text of the DSM-IV TR in 2004. And many of us, so it did not appear in the original DSM-IV in 1990. There is tremendous concern within the community, as you've heard here, that showcasing this word and Blanchard's theories of sexual deviance as motivation for transition of all trans women, that decision in 2004 prefaced an agenda to codify autogynephilia as either a new diagnosis or an expansion of the existing transvestic fetishism diagnosis. And that is concern that is very, very widespread throughout our community. Number 8, false positive diagnosis of those who are no longer gender dysphoric after transition, and of gender nonconforming children who were never gender dysphoric. And this is almost astonishing in the case of children. But children, because children and adults and adolescents have separate diagnostic criteria under this category. And for the diagnostic criteria for children, children can be diagnosed with gender identity disorder with no evidence of gender dysphoria. In other words, a child who has never said, I was born in the wrong sex, Mom, I need to be a girl, or I need to be a boy, or showing any dissatisfaction with their bodies or any dissatisfaction with their assigned birth role. Children with none of that can be diagnosed with GID and referred to treatment on the basis of social nonconformity alone to the stereotypes of their assigned birth sex. And that's in criterion A and repeated in criterion B for children. That's scary stuff. And these are children basically being too butch or too femme. And we're talking about children that have nothing to do with trans identities, and certainly nothing to do with transsexual identities, that can be labeled as mentally ill strictly on that basis, with no regard for the definition of mental illness itself, which is well defined in the DSM and is based on clinically significant distress and impairment. And in even that definition is muddied, deliberately muddied, in the diagnostic criteria, in that there is nothing to prevent an interpretation that being the victim of social discrimination, which causes distress or may cause impairment, there is nothing to prevent that from being used as a diagnostic symptom. And in fact, the authors, we've talked about Kenneth Zucker today, we haven't talked about Susan Bradley. She's not involved in the DSM-5, but she was very involved in the DSM-4. So authors of this current diagnosis from the former Clark Institute, the current CAMH, in their own clinical publications, have made it very, very clear that they consider being a victim of social prejudice to be symptomatic of mental illness under this definition. And what about adults or children? What about people who have transitioned? Folks, there ain't no exit clause. Once you meet the diagnostic criteria, this is the Roach Motel of psychiatric classification, because there ain't no way out. Like I said, it's probably wrong of me to use myself as an example, because most of my friends consider me to be a little more than a little doolally, independent of my gender. But the point is that, as a transitioned woman, and in my example, as a post-op woman, I am more mentally ill according to the diagnostic criteria than before. So when we talk about needing a diagnostic criteria that enables access to transition procedures, this one is extremely problematic. And successive revisions of the DSM have gotten worse. Actually, when transsexualism was first introduced in the DSM-3 in 1980, it was much more clear about gender dysphoria and about the focus of pathology than it is today. Number 9, conflation, and I touched on this a second ago, conflation of impairment caused by prejudice with distress that is intrinsic to gender dysphoria. So people that need access to medical procedures, and on the basis of distress, and those of us who have experienced, and thank God, a great many people in the trans community never experience this, but for those of us who do, we know that it can be debilitating, it can be fatal. And there needs to be clarity around it, because we know that access to hormones for some, or maybe hormones and surgery for others, can be extremely effective in mitigating this distress. But if it is subsumed by a concept of impairment that includes social discrimination, which we are all subject to, and of course we are more subject to, that discrimination is exacerbated by this kind of, by these psychiatric stereotypes, then you have over-included a whole bunch of people that should never meet the definition of mental illness with a label of mental illness. And once again, we have neglected a way to provide access to transition care for those who need it. And number 10, and you've heard about this so well previously today, the placement in the class of sexual disorders. Interestingly enough, in 1994, well, I'm sorry, in 1987 in the DSM-3R, gender identity disorder was moved out of sexual disorders and into a class called disorders usually first evident in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Now that's a big mouthful, but it was kind of a positive clarification. And in the DSM-4 in 1990, again, under dominance of, at the time, the Clark Institute, that decision was undone. And we were moved back to the section of sexual disorders. And this simply reinforces stereotypes of sexual deviance for all gender variant people. So that's my top 10 list, and it paints a pretty grim picture of the status quo, because status quo is a pretty grim situation. The DSM-5, this manual, major revisions where they're allowed to actually reclassify, add new diagnoses, delete old diagnoses, and change the diagnostic criteria. That only happens about every 20 years. So the effects are very far-reaching. There are a number of long and short-term proposals. The proposals we can think of as more strategic in the long term and more tactical in the short term, that are on the table from affirming and supportive mental health professionals and from people inside the community. I think some of the more promising long-term proposals that I personally support, would move diagnostic classification for the purpose of access to hormonal and surgical transition care out of the psychiatric realm into the physical medical realm. I think that's going to take a good deal of work, a good deal of education, a good deal of thought about specific diagnostic criteria, and sensitivity, again, respect of the diversity within our community, because we don't want to imply that anything is wrong, physically or mentally, with people who are happy with their lives and happy with their bodies and happy with their status. But I think that general direction, Hawk Stone has certainly articulated at WPATH at Creating Change. I hope he talked about it in his session here. His thoughts on such strategies, and other people as well. In the short term, my personal focus is on the DSM-5. And the reason is, whatever we do in parallel toward longer term strategies, whatever gets codified in the DSM-5, our community will likely be stuck with through the 2020s. And those consequences could be devastating to an awful lot of lives. So my focus is what I call, and I try not to paint a falsely rosy picture. I call it harm reduction in the DSM-5, because as I've described, successive revisions of the DSM since transsexualism was introduced in the DSM-3 have gotten worse, more pathologizing, less respectful, and more broadly over-inclusive of people who should not be tagged as mentally ill. So changing the direction from successfully worse to not worse is sort of been the focus of my efforts. A lot of discussion. So as most everybody knows, the DSM-5 is in progress now. These committees have been chosen. The process is more secretive and less transparent and less accountable than it ever has been in the past, and that's scary. The same institution, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, University of Toronto, still plays an even more dominant role in gender disorders definition than they did in 2004 and in 1990. And that's pretty grim. But we do have thoughtful people, we do have allies, we do have supportive people within the profession. We have some good moderates, I believe, within the task force itself, within the DSM task force. And we certainly have, I believe that there are some affirming, thoughtful people in American psychiatry. And so a lot of these proposals are going to be discussed and debated at the upcoming American Psychiatric Association meeting in San Francisco in May. I'm fortunate enough to be able to present a paper there. There will probably be opinions expressed loudly in the conference, in the scientific sessions, and out in the streets. But It's an issue. These are issues that everyone in our community has a stake in, and everyone should be aware of. So I know that if you have any questions, I think we're getting to time.